Hi and welcome to part 2 of how PvE in World of Warcraft has changed throughout the expansions. In part 1 we left it at Cataclysm. So we're going to be starting off with Mists of Pandaria, and that brought with it a very different style of raiding and dungeoneering. Now, dungeons were a tale of extremes. On the one hand, the heroic dungeons were nothing more than level cap dungeons. They had no level of challenge at all for most players. They were just something to gear up a little for and then just run once a day for the Valor points. On the other end of the scale, however, we had challenge mode introduced. These were difficult versions of the dungeons which only rewarded cosmetic items if certain timers were beat. It brought dungeons back into serious regular use for players who were interested in them. Players could not only beat the timers to get access to the mounts and cosmetic gear on offer, but also compete for best times on a leaderboard with other groups. Legendaries now came in the form of an expansion-long questline, which rewarded a legendary gem fairly early on and a legendary cloak for the final tier. This was accessible by everyone, and the raid parts of the quest could be found in LFR. As such, everyone could acquire these legendaries, though LFR raiders would obtain them a little later. Daily quests were introduced to WoW as early as vanilla, but in MoP they went on a rampage. At the start of the expansion, from hitting level cap, your spare time every day would involve visiting a host of NPCs with blue exclamation signs above their heads, hoping against hope for the quicker ones to complete. All of this was done in the name of not only acquiring Valor points, which could be used for various upgrades, but the rep needed for the best vendor items. MoP also saw two massive innovations in raiding. From the start, the lesser charm of good fortune was brought in. This has been known by several names, but takes the form of a limited number of rolls for bonus loot, personal to the player on raid bosses. Now, players had one more thing to complain about, as every time it didn't award loot, half the LFR group would bemoan their terrible luck as they never got anything. But it also allowed for a slightly faster gearing process with 3 extra bites of the cherry each week for each player. The effective number of items that was now dropping from bosses had significantly increased, though this extra loot couldn't be traded to other players if it wasn't wanted. But the changes to gearing didn't stop there. From the second tier of the expansion, Thunder Forging was introduced. This would become known as War Forging in the next tier, and remained so called up until now at least. And it means that gear had a small random chance to drop a higher item level version. This meant that even heroic raiders who had collected their BIS set at a time when such a thing still existed could continue farming to get the real BIS stuff, and for some this would never be achieved. At the end of the expansion, the next innovation came in the form of flexible mode raiding. This also introduced a 4th difficulty to raids, which has persisted to this day, albeit with different names now. Finally, the very last boss of the expansion, Garrosh, had a chance to drop an heirloom weapon, which could be useful in levelling through the following expansion. This kept people running the raids during the very long content drought at the end of the expansion. Now, with the release of Warlords of Draenor, challenge dungeons changed a little in that completing one a day would reward some gear to help people kit themselves up for the release of the first raid. Previously, it had only been cosmetic. In other regards, challenge mode dungeons remained similar to MoP, but with cosmetic weapons to complement the armour from the previous expansion. Raids adopted their current difficulty names of LFR, Normal and Heroic, which were both made flexible between 10 and 30 players, with a fixed mythic raid size of 20. 25-man guilds had to shed some players or continue with a bloated roster, while 10-man guilds had to merge, massively recruit or remain as heroic raiders. WoD also saw a fairly significant delay before any tier bosses became available. With War Forging from the previous expansion, the general idea was extended by applying it to dungeon gear as well as having sockets be a random chance on any item, as opposed to appearing predictably on gear. Raiders could also obtain a random piece of gear from a garrison mission cache every couple of weeks. The quality of the piece would be determined by the level of raiding that character was accomplishing during the tier in question. Other changes to gearing came from LFR and crafting. LFR gear was no longer just a lower item level version of the other raid modes. There were unique pieces which did include set bonuses, but these were not as strong as the tier sets from organised raids. Similarly, trinkets were generally weaker than those which could be obtained in the other raids. On the whole, LFR bosses were a lot more forgiving than they had been in the past, though certain bosses could still pose serious problems, mainly the end of tier bosses. Crafted gear also changed in that crafters could now create gear with random stats, and they could also craft items to upgrade these. In this way, it was possible to buy some equipment which would be fairly high item level, along with the stats you wanted for newly dinged characters. The drawback is that you could only equip a maximum of 3 such pieces, but it did allow you to compensate if you weren't having much luck with upgrades in a few slots. Later on in the expansion, mythic dungeons were released, but these were not well received as they were exactly the same as heroic ones, but with greater numbers. For well-geared characters, this made them no more difficult in reality. However, they did give you a chance to acquire a set of useful heirloom trinkets. Legendaries followed a similar pattern to that in MoP, with the exception that the final boss of the expansion, Archimond, would also drop an item that allowed you to upgrade your legendary ring's item level each week. The purpose of this was similar to the heirloom weapons from Garrosh. You had a reason to keep running the raids long after you might otherwise stop, and this was useful for the content drought that was to come. And finally we move into Legion. There are a large number of changes made to PvE in this expansion. The first was the introduction of Mythic Plus dungeons. These allowed dungeons to become genuine endgame content for competitive players. They allow you a system of increasing difficulty via affixes, the increasingly harsh numbers until you're eventually not able to beat the content. Just as with the now defunct challenge mode, you have a timer to beat, the difference being that Mythic Plus dungeons award gear, which is useful even to hard mode raiders at a high enough level. Titan Forging is perhaps the change to PvE with the greatest impact. Now even normal mode drops have a chance to become the best pieces in the game, though increasingly unlikely as the expansion rumbles on. Still, it means that even casual players can obtain some of the best pieces in the game, and is a reason why running lots of Mythic Plus dungeons can be an excellent route to well-geared characters. The main downside of Titan Forging has been for raiders who must keep running farm bosses which drop BIS pieces long after they have obtained them, on the off chance that a Titan Forged version drops. Legendaries changed out of all recognition. Now we have a huge number of legendary items to farm which have a random chance to drop from a variety of endgame PvE content. A very unpopular system which will not continue into the next expansion. It has been the bane of both re-rollers and players wanting to join the expansion late on. Only now are Blizzard about to implement a catch-up system for those who are behind the curve with obtaining these powerful items. Raids maintain the same difficulties as in WoD, but LFR once again awarded items which were lower item duplicates of that from other raids. The only exception being that the Pantheon trinkets from the final raid tier cannot be acquired in LFR. Crafted gear had the maximum of 3 equipped items dropped, and the item level you could boost these to exceeded that of the previous expansion. The drawback this time was you couldn't buy the upgraded version of these pieces, as upgrading them made them soulbound. As such, a low item level character was likely to need to do some farming to get the drops needed to upgrade them, by which time you'd probably have some nice pieces and would only need a small number of crafted pieces to be upgraded anyway. Gear could also be obtained from vendors by farming special currencies, which allowed lower geared characters a way of catching up by doing a lot of solo based content. Dailies were replaced by world quests which could award a variety of rewards, including gear which could Titan Forge into useful upgrades if you were lucky. Weapons changed completely, with each player having an artifact weapon granted at the start of the expansion which they would keep throughout. This weapon was made more powerful with relic drops, and through an artifact power pseudo talent system, artifact power could be obtained by most types of endgame content, and so gave a reason for people to keep running content on a regular basis. So there we are. That is how the experience of playing group PvE, especially in World of Warcraft, has changed through the years. And I'm sure it will continue to change over the next few years as well. I hope you enjoyed this series. If you haven't watched part 1 already, then there's a link to that just there. If you've enjoyed it, don't forget to like, comment, subscribe and share with others. And until next time, I'll see you later.